Okay, so the French Revolution is what the bell ringer is about, and this is the first of the two chapters. So please make sure that you look that over for chapter 10, what pages you were assigned. And today we'll begin by talking about the French Revolution. Also in this unit, of course, we'll cover what some argue is the continuation of the French Revolution, which was the reign of Napoleon. But France obviously is one of the more influential European cultures, and it was the greatest example of some of the aspects of feudalism that continued to exist from the old regime. Aristocrats did not like the fact that the monarch was so powerful there. The middle class didn't like that the nobility had privilege. And the peasants didn't like that their lives were terrible, especially because of the continued economic decline. Generally, the revolution is thought of in 4 stages. The moderate stage, from 1789 to 92. The radical stage, from 92 to 94. The Directory, from 94 to 99. And then Napoleon, from 99 to 1815. Mm-hmm.
Napoleon. Was he president of France?
No, he was made what was called First Consul of France, and then eventually declared the emperor. So long-term causes included, of course, class conflict, especially since French society was divided into 3 estates, each of them with equal power. The clergy made up the first estate.
You know a lot about history.
I would hope. The second estate was the nobles. And the third estate was everybody else. And since each of them had an equal say, that obviously was looked at as a gross inequality. Making noble privilege seem ridiculous, of course, was that over 50,000 new nobles had been created in the 1700s. So the middle class was saying, hey, if you can just make people nobles, why do they have these special privileges if anybody can just become a noble?
So was it easy to move up in the classes, is what you're saying?
No, only if you were favored by the monarch. Because the monarch is the one that made the new nobles. 50,000.
You made 50,000.
Yes, not one king in particular, but a series of kings from 1700 to 1789.
That only be like 4 or 5. That's a lot of. So they just sign documents all day, like he's a noble, he's a noble, he's a noble.
They would often make lists so you could incorporate multiple people at the same
So they had wealth.
They might, or it might be because of military service, for instance.
Oh, right, okay.
Anyway, the noble wealth had been tied to land, but the middle class wealth was tied to trade. things like banking and shipping and slavery. And so that meant that there was another class conflict within the Third Estate, because there you had these middle class people who had growing wealth, and then the bulk of the population, which were peasants. Many of the Enlightenment thinkers,
Why are you thinking so hard about that?
many of the Enlightenment thinkers had inspired the idea that a government should protect the people. And so a group emerged focused on economics, known as physiocrats, spelled Physiocrats. Physiocrats. The physiocrats believed in simple taxes, an unregulated economy, so they wanted to take government out. Government was taxing too much. Government had too many laws that favored certain groups of people. Government tried to control too many aspects of business.
Similar to libertarian.
Yes, absolutely. The French economy, the reason why they're calling for this is because the French economy was hurting badly. There have been a lot of poor harvests in the 1780s thanks to the Little Ice Age. Mm-hmm. For the poor, up to 80% of their income went to purchasing bread. French bread. And since so much money had to go toward food, it meant that there wasn't a lot left over to go toward other goods. And so people who made other goods also saw a decline. And not only that, most of the taxation was focused on the lower class, giving them an extra reason to hate the government. The tax system on top of that was incredibly inefficient, with a considerable portion being skimmed off the top by government agents.
Are you a Republican?
I can't tell you that.
Does Nixon stick with him?
That's just a sticker.
Smith's physiotocracy.
Is what?
Physiotocracy.
Is it a word?
Yeah. To be to acting.
I don't know. It might be. I've only ever heard the word physiocrats. The Crown's finance ministers were often unable to cure all these problems. And the only solution they often had was to increase taxes. So it seemed like the government was incapable of making good decisions or reforms. And that's when we started to see the destruction of the old regime. So this wouldn't, when we say the destruction of the regime, we're not just talking about the beheading of the king, but we're talking about some of the changes that were made before that even happened. And that includes the moderate stage. The financial crisis led to Louis calling the Assembly of Notables, which the royal family hadn't used in a considerable period of time. The aristocrats that were part of this called for greater reform. And in order to do this, Louis also had to call up, in 1788, the Estates General. That's what's pictured there on the screen. And each of the estates sent representatives, but each estate only got one vote. So the clergy as a group got one vote, the nobles as a group got one vote, and everyone else.
There was 3 votes.
Yes.
That doesn't make any sense.
Everyone else in the country, which made up 90% of the population, got one vote. So obviously, that was a problem because the nobles and aristocrats could always outvote the common people. Plus, on top of that, those delegates that went to the Estates General for the Third Estate, as I mentioned earlier, they were wealthy or successful professionals. 25% were lawyers. 43% were government officials. Yes.
How do they decide who's the representatives of the poor people?
They had local choices through town councils, things like that would occur. Meeting places like churches, for instance, in order to draw up delegates based on population, but also geography. That selection was not necessarily fair either. But they drew up a list of grievances, but obviously the vote was the most controversial thing. The Third Estate proposed that they should increase, or at least double, their vote. But Louis was opposed to that. And so eventually, after hearing that Louis might dismiss the Estates General altogether, the Third Estate decides to go down the street to a tennis court.
Play tennis?
Yeah.
Wait, like actual tennis? Like,
Yes.
they call it the tennis court because they're on a tennis court.
Yes.
Look.
So they decided to take an oath to stay faithful to the French people and insist upon reform.
The nobles made this oath?
Well, there would be some nobles that might go along with this, but it's mostly going to be common people. So, this coincided with a number of popular revolts that sprang up throughout the country, but especially Paris, mostly because of soaring bread prices.
The bread rebellions.
There were rumors that Louis was going to try to stop all of this reform. So workers, known as the Sans-Culottes, organized a militia. So workers organized a militia.
some truth though behind everything.
Hmm?
I'm sure he tried to do something.
Yeah. The people realized that they needed weapons if they were going to have militia. So they ended up storming the Bastille.
That's,
Bastille.
you know, you know, song.
And what's it called? Was it called the Storm of the Bastille?
Yes. This is
Oh,
on July 14th of 1789, where the people overrun this part prison, part castle, where they also stored weapons.
People die.
what was the
Yes,
place-
absolutely. The warden and a number of the guards their bodies were torn apart, their heads are put on pikes and paraded around
Wait, what, they stormed what?
That's awesome.
the Bastille.
No, the second place, the prison. Was that it?
That is it, yes. Mhm.
Poor guards, you know, they're just other people.
That's right.
Don't we-
Shortly after, the great fear spreads. There are rumors after these events that the king's army was going to set upon the city.
Is it true?
Believing that the local nobles were in league with him and they were keeping records of what everyone was doing, the peasants stormed a number of noble houses to destroy records,
I can see how.
burning them to the ground.
Out of hand.
Yes. A lot of it based on rumors, too. And mostly just in Paris. By October, the people in Paris demanded that Louis return to the city. And so the Parisian women, the women of Paris, marched. It's not too far of a walk, but they marched to Versailles.
Or-
I don't know if it's 10 or 12 miles. I can't remember.
Wow.
But anyway, the women marched there to demand his return.
Just what?
His return. This group that had formed in the tennis court oath has now become the National Assembly. And they vote to end all forms of privilege.
What happened to Britain during this time? Are they not known for a weak country?
Britain was still pretty strong. They'd lost the revolution, but they're still one of the strongest countries.
Who?
Britain.
No, I mean, why did Britain go for a weak France? Seems pretty easy.
I don't think they wanted to become involved. They still had their own empire to take care of. They didn't want to necessarily take sides. They were leery of people trying to take out a king because Britain was still a monarchy. And so they had already begun some of the reforms of the revolution. Eventually, an important document, probably one of the most important in world history, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen was written.
That's not that important.
Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen.
What about woman? Why does it mean man and citizen?
Why not woman?
Does that mean man and woman and child?
That was one of the criticisms that it didn't necessarily specifically outline women, but citizens were just men at the time.
So or a woman.
So there are some rights for men, and there are some rights for citizens.
So they're all men now.
All the citizens are men. Yes.
That means all the men are citizens.
No, not necessarily. That would change throughout the revolution. Sometimes it would be everybody. Sometimes it would only be if you paid taxes. Sometimes it would only be if you own land.
My abducted argument.
But anyhow, in this document, they recognized natural rights. like the right to property, liberty, security, and they also recognize freedoms of expression and equality.
Do you believe in those things?
Absolutely.
Yeah, you believe in equality.
He's actually very proactive. This Baker is, well, actually, one of the two religions.
It also recognized two groups of people: passive citizens who were guaranteed rights, active citizens who paid taxes and therefore could hold office. Passive citizens that were guaranteed rights, and active citizens that paid taxes and could hold office.
Who can hold office?
People who paid taxes.
To the top.
Eventually, the National Assembly also abolished slavery. But as I mentioned before, the rights of women were a secondary issue at best. One other topic that was controversial, besides if women should be recognized with rights or not, would be the state of religion. After all, the clergy had a special place in French society. They had been part of the First Estate. And so, even though there are a lot of people faithful to Catholicism, they weren't necessarily to the liking of some of the clergy in France. So the National Assembly seized church property, and they developed a constitution for the clergy. That might sound like a good thing, but it also meant that they, of course, were subject to the law and that their salaries were actually paid by the government, which meant they could possibly be controlled by the government. The reason why this was controversial is because obviously a lot of the poor still looked up to their local priests.
Oh, no.
And then one of the more significant reforms that would take place would be changing how it's organized. The systems before had been based on local nobles and obviously didn't always make sense geographically, had odd shapes. And so instead, France was divided up into departments, which were more compact. 83 at the time,
So
equal
you're saying
departments.
districts.
So it's like a county.
It's like a
Yes.
county or district.
France.
Yes.
States.
Yes,
It's a lot of states.
it is.
A lot of states indeed. And those still existing today?
They do still exist today.
Oh, that many?
Yes, I don't know if the exact number is the same, but almost as many. What's that?
Do they all look like that today?
I believe a number of them do. I don't know if 100% do, though. But anyway, guilds were also abolished, and the land, the church land that had been seized, was sold to get revenue.
They have 27 states. That's pretty cool. No, they're a lot bigger this time. Oh, they're called departments, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's like 50 still.
Just one final thing I'll attempt to mention is that there was a Declaration of Rights of Women written to counteract the previous document that I mentioned, but of course, this was mostly ignored. So tomorrow we'll continue by talking about the next stage of the revolution, and you can use the rest of the time to finish up the reading, or if you'd like, the activities from Unit 5.